The sun bled low over the mesas, spilling its last gold light across the dry land until everything shimmered red and copper. The prairie stretched for miles, silent except for the whisper of wind through the scrub and the occasional rattle of a grasshopper taking flight. Caleb Dunn sat on the porch of his cabin with a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. The chair beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight, a sound that felt almost like company. He was a tall man, carved lean by work and weather, with a face that might have once been kind before life scraped the softness out of it. His hat sat low over his brow, shadowing eyes that didn't often lift to meet another's. In town, they called him quiet, though most meant broken. Caleb didn't much mind what they called him. Talking hadn't done him any good since the day he buried his brother Jesse under a cottonwood tree 7 years back. Most days followed the same rhythm. Wake before dawn, ride fence lines, check cattle, fix what needed fixing, eat when the sun dipped, sleep when the coyotes started singing. Silence filled the gaps, and after a while, he learned not to fear it. That morning had started no different, except for a run into Canyon Ridge for supplies, flour, nails, and a bit of tobacco. He tied his horse outside the post office, nodding at the postmaster, old Henry Whitcomb, who was sweeping dust from the steps. "Morning, Dunn," Henry said, leaning on his broom. "Got something for you today, believe it or not." Caleb frowned. He didn't get letters. There was no one left to write him. Henry shuffled through a small stack, pulling out a yellowed envelope. Addressed to a Mr. Jesse Dunn, Box 12, Canyon Ridge. He squinted at it. Guess it's been making the rounds a while before finding the right box. Figured I'd hand it to you instead. Caleb hesitated before taking it. The name was written in a careful, looping script, a woman's hand, delicate but steady. He turned it over. No return address, just a faint postmark from some town back east he didn't recognize. He slid it into his saddlebag without a word. By the time he rode home, the sun was long gone, replaced by the cold sweep of stars. Inside the cabin, he lit a lantern, its small flame chasing shadows from the corners. The letter lay on the table beside his coffee pot. He meant to leave it there. Jess's business was long finished, but the longer he looked, the heavier it felt, as if it carried some unfinished piece of his brother's life. Finally, he pulled his knife from his belt and slit it open. The paper crackled softly, the smell of dust and old ink rising up like memory. "Mr. Dunn," it began, in neat, unhurried writing, "you do not know me, but my husband rode with your brother during the war." Caleb froze, reading on. The woman wrote of hard times, of a husband who had spoken highly of the Dunn brothers, of honor, of kindness. Her husband was dead now, she said. She was a widow with a young daughter and nowhere to go. He told me, the letter continued, that should I ever find myself in need, I could write to you, that you were men of character. I do not ask charity, only work or a roof long enough to get us on our feet. It was signed simply, Evelyn Harper. Caleb sat for a long while staring at her name, the lantern light flickering across his face. Jesse had always been the one people turned to, the one who laughed easy and offered help without being asked. Caleb was the shadow that followed, the quiet brother. He looked down at the letter again. It had been written to a dead man. If he had done the proper thing, he'd have sent it back marked return to sender. But something about it, maybe the mention of his brother, maybe the thought of a woman in her child lost somewhere in the wide, hard country, gnawed at him. He folded the letter carefully, as if it might bruise, and set it beside his coffee cup. Outside, the coyotes began to sing, their voices high and lonely. Caleb leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, and for the first time in years, he didn't find comfort in the silence. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jess's face, grinning, alive, and a woman's handwriting reaching across time and distance to find the wrong brother. By dawn, the decision had been made, though he wouldn't have been able to say when. When he saddled his mare the next morning, the letter was tucked safe in his coat pocket. He didn't know what he'd do about it yet, but the prairie wind carried a feeling he hadn't known in a long time, something that felt almost like purpose. 3 weeks passed before the letter's echo reached Caleb's doorstep. In that time, he'd ridden his usual routes, fixed 2 broken fence posts, and tried to forget the neat handwriting that had unsettled his quiet world. He told himself the woman might never come. Maybe she'd found help somewhere else. Maybe she'd realized the letter had been sent to a grave. But on a dusty afternoon in late spring, while the wind chased tumbleweed across the road, a wagon appeared on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be a rancher passing through, one of those families heading west. But the closer it came, the slower it moved, the more he could see how tired it was. The mule pulling it limped, and the wheels creaked in protest with every turn. Inside sat a woman and a small girl, their clothes plain, faces shaded beneath bonnets that had seen better days. When they stopped in front of the Canyon Ridge post office, the woman climbed down, straightened her skirt, and looked around as if searching for a landmark she'd only ever seen in stories. Her movements were careful, polite, the way a person moves when they've learned the world doesn't owe them kindness. She introduced herself to the postmaster, Evelyn Harper, she said, from Kansas City. The man blinked at the name, then frowned in quiet recognition. "You're looking for one of the Dunn boys, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. "Mr. Jesse Dunn. I wrote him a letter some weeks back. My husband served with him, long ago." Her voice trembled only slightly, but the exhaustion in her eyes told a truer story. The postmaster hesitated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "Jesse Dunn's been gone near 7 years now. Buried up on the ridge, just past the cottonwoods." For a heartbeat, Evelyn didn't seem to understand. Her lips parted, her gloved hand coming to her chest as though she might hold her heart still. The little girl beside her, clutching a worn rag doll, looked up in confusion. "Mama." Evelyn knelt, smoothing the girl's hair. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered, though her own voice broke on the words. Then she stood, gathering herself with the sort of strength only widows seem to know. "Thank you, sir. I'm sorry for the mistake. We'll be on our way." Caleb heard about them before dusk. Word traveled fast in Canyon Ridge, especially when strangers came through. Henry the postmaster rode out himself, bringing the story. "A woman and her girl," he said, breathless from the ride. "She came looking for Jesse. Said her husband rode with him. Looks like they don't have much left but that wagon." Caleb didn't answer right away. He sat at the table, staring at the wood grain as if it held the words he needed. Then, without saying a thing, he rose, grabbed his hat, and stepped outside. By the time he reached town, the sky had begun to turn violet. He spotted the wagon easily. It sat at the edge of the main street, the mule tethered to a hitching post, the woman trying to patch a broken wheel with a length of rope. Her daughter sat on the wagon bench, legs swinging, humming a tune to her doll. Caleb dismounted and approached slowly. When Evelyn looked up, she froze. Dust streaked her cheeks, but her posture was straight, proud despite everything. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "You wrote a letter to my brother." Something flickered in her eyes, hope, confusion, then sorrow. "I did," she said softly. "But they told me he's gone. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trouble you." He shook his head. "Ain't no trouble." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the wind pulling at her skirt, the mule shifting its weight restlessly. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice low, hesitant, as if the words were rusty from disuse. "You and your girl got anywhere to go?" Evelyn looked down. "No," she admitted. "We left what little we had behind. I thought there might be work here, or at least a place to start again. I was wrong." Caleb studied her, the exhaustion carved into her face, the little girl watching them both with wide, wary eyes. There was a part of him, old, cautious, that wanted to turn away, to stay inside the safety of silence. But another part, the one that had stirred when he read her letter, wouldn't let him. "You can come up to my place," he said finally. "It's a ways out, but there's food and a roof. You can rest a spell. After that, we'll figure something." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the offer. "I couldn't impose." "You wouldn't be," he interrupted gently. "My brother would have done the same." She hesitated, then nodded, gratitude and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. They rode together in silence beneath a rising moon, the wagon creaking behind his horse. The prairie stretched around them, endless and empty, but for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel alone in it. When they reached the cabin, Evelyn helped her daughter down and stood staring at the small house, weathered but sturdy, framed by cottonwoods that whispered softly in the wind. Inside, she set to work as though it were the most natural thing in the world, unpacking a few belongings, sweeping the floor, lighting a fire. By the time supper was ready, a simple stew made from what Caleb had in the pantry, the air was filled with the scent of onions and warmth. Lila, the girl, nodded off by the hearth, her doll clutched tight in her small hands. Evelyn sat at the table across from him, her posture still careful but her eyes softer now. "Thank you, Mr. Dunn," she said, "for your kindness." Caleb only nodded. He wasn't sure what to say, so he said nothing at all. But as the wind brushed the cabin walls and the lantern light danced across her face, he realized the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like something waiting to grow. Outside, the coyotes called again, distant and mournful. Inside, for the first time in 7 years, Caleb Dunn did not hear them alone. The days slipped into one another, soft as dust falling through sunlight. At first, Evelyn and her daughter stayed out of the way, uncertain whether their welcome was meant to last. Caleb gave them space. He rose before dawn, tended the horses, rode the ridges as he always had, but every evening he found himself drawn back sooner than he used to, listening for the quiet hum of Evelyn's voice or the soft laughter of her little girl drifting from the porch. Evelyn had a way of making things right without asking permission. She washed the soot-black kettle until it shone, stitched up the curtains that had hung crooked since Jess's time, and coaxed green shoots from the dry patch of earth behind the cabin. When Caleb returned one afternoon, dusty and tired, he found herbs growing there, rosemary, sage, and a few beans climbing a bit of twine. The sight stopped him. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a miracle. Lila, the daughter, followed him everywhere. She was light on her feet and full of questions. How old was his horse? Why did he wear his hat even inside? Had he ever seen the ocean? He answered what he could, gruffly at first, then with a trace of amusement. He couldn't remember the last time a child had spoken his name out loud, or the last time he'd smiled without realizing it. Sometimes in the evenings, Evelyn would read aloud from one of the few books she'd brought in her wagon, a worn volume of poetry. Her voice was soft but sure, filling the little cabin with something that wasn't quite joy, but wasn't sorrow either. Caleb sat by the window, whittling small shapes from scrap wood, pretending not to listen, though every word lingered in him like a flame he didn't want to admit he needed. One night, when a storm rolled over the plains, they all stayed close to the hearth. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked over the hills. Lila clung to her doll, frightened, until Caleb told her stories, old cowboy tales Jesse used to tell him when they were boys. His voice was rough but steady, and before long, the girl's eyes drooped and she slept curled up in her mother's lap. When the thunder quieted, Evelyn looked over at him through the dim light. "You loved your brother," she said softly. Caleb's hand stilled on the piece of wood he'd been carving. "More than anything. He must have been a good man." "He was," Caleb said. "Better than me." Evelyn shook her head gently. "Goodness isn't measured by words, Mr. Dunn. Sometimes it's in what a man doesn't say." He didn't answer, but something in his chest eased at that. Later that week, while she was tidying the table, she found the old letter again. The paper was creased now, its edges worn soft from being handled. Caleb had kept it close, tucked inside a Bible he hadn't opened in years. She looked at him questioningly as she held it up. "I shouldn't have opened it," he admitted, his voice low. "It wasn't mine to read." She studied him for a long moment, then folded the letter gently and set it back on the table. "Maybe it was," she said. "Maybe it found the right man after all." The wind outside carried the scent of rain and wild sage. For the first time, Caleb didn't feel the weight of silence pressing on him. He felt the quiet of something alive, something waiting to be spoken. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into the beginning of summer. The garden began to grow, the horses grew sleek again, and the cabin no longer looked like a place that belonged to ghosts. Caleb sometimes caught himself humming when he worked. Lila ran barefoot through the grass, chasing fireflies. Evelyn laughed more often, and her laughter did something strange and steady to his heart. One evening, when the sky was painted in long strokes of orange and violet, Caleb sat at the table with a sheet of paper in front of him. He'd cleaned his hands, found the old inkwell Jesse used, and written slowly, carefully, the way a man does when he hasn't written in years. "Dear Mrs. Harper," the letter began, "this is Caleb Dunn, brother to the man you meant to write. Your letter came to me by mistake, but I've come to believe some mistakes are the Lord's own way of setting things right." He paused, staring at the half-written page, the ink still wet. "If you'll stay," he continued, "this place could use your hands." And maybe my heart could use your company. When he finished, he folded the letter but didn't hand it to her. Instead, he left it on the table and went outside, standing under the wide, endless sky. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like memory, soft and forgiving. The next morning, Evelyn found the letter. She read it in the quiet light of dawn, her fingers trembling slightly. When Caleb came in from the stables, she didn't speak. She simply poured him a cup of coffee, set it in front of him, and smiled. A small, knowing smile that said she'd already answered. Caleb looked at her, at the warmth in her eyes, and something in him finally gave way. He smiled back, slow, genuine, the kind of smile that hadn't touched his face since Jesse was alive. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and golden. The wind carried laughter instead of loneliness. And the cowboy, who had sat in silence for 7 long years, found that the quiet wasn't empty anymore, it was full of everything he'd been waiting for.